Security is something that we've all been working on in some capacity for a very long time. One of the things that really is bringing this issue to the forefront is, unfortunately, the very tragic situation that's happening in Ukraine right now, where you have seen Russia weaponize vulnerable IoT devices and botnets more generally to conduct massive waves of DDoS attacks, both against Ukrainian military, armed forces, and we've also seen it against critical infrastructure such as the banking system, including banks serving up to 20 million customers. We've seen botnets used in global disinformation campaigns, and we've heard a variety of experts raise questions about some of the security considerations around IoT in industry verticals within critical infrastructure. So just to get us started, and with this context in mind, I would be interested in each of you describing how your organizations view IoT security threat generally, and then if you want to weigh in on any of the more recent geopolitical nuances, but no obligation there.
All right, I'll be the guinea pig and go first. So as I mentioned earlier, from an AT&T standpoint, right, we're interconnected with networks around the world. You know, if those networks are sending bad traffic to us because they're being used by attackers for things like DDoS and other types of attacks, obviously a concern. So IoT devices have the, you know, if they're insecure and they don't have at least some measure of security built into them, there is a risk that they could be leveraged, just like they were with Mirai, to facilitate some of these large-scale attacks. So I think, you know, the ongoing concern from a network perspective is how do we minimize that risk? You know, there are things we can do at the network level. There's certain things that we've done in the past, like identifying, you know, certain ports and other things that are leveraged by some of these types of attacks that we can turn off. But at the end of the day, it also requires kind of an end-to-end type of solution that involves the device makers, the software, it involves the networks, et cetera, to try to manage that environment. And so we certainly see it as a risk. And something that needs to be dealt with. You know, I think there's been a lot of work happening within the U.S. government around that, and we can speak to that more here on the panel, to put together different types of standards that could be utilized to protect some of the IoT devices. As it relates to Ukraine, you know, I can't speak on the specifics because I don't, you know, I've been focused mostly on how we secure AT&T's network, which is, you know, obviously we don't really operate in Ukraine. But, you know, I do think the types of attacks that we've seen there are certainly things that we need to be keeping an eye on and making sure that we have the right protections in place to ensure that that type of thing doesn't happen here in the U.S. if it ever were to become an issue here.
Everything Chris said, I will second, but I will add to that from a standards perspective, it's important to try to move that work internationally and get it accepted globally, because obviously networks are global, threats are global, and if we get more buy-in and more adoption of baseline security standard, then the less likely we are to have global outages.
Yeah, and I would just add from a law enforcement perspective, you know, for us, it's just a reminder of the severity of the threat associated with nation-state actors like Russia. And as Chris mentioned, as we've seen in the past with Russia, you know, they've used Ukraine as a bit of a test ground for things that they may deploy into the cyberspace, you know, going forward. So from an intelligence and law enforcement standpoint, those are certainly things that we're paying attention to see what may, you know, present here in the not too distant future.
Now, as we're looking at this issue more broadly, beyond just the Ukraine situation, which is, you know, the recent event that is on a lot of people's minds, we've seen a large variety of use cases for the malware that infects IoT devices, beyond just the botnets that we've been discussing. And there's also been a lot of collaboration, not just within industry, but also within industry and government working together. So I was hoping that there could be some discussion of both the effectiveness and the benefits of the public-private partnership, both in terms of getting us to more secure devices, but also in terms of managing some of the consequences, which could include, for example, collaboration with law enforcement. And Wayne, since I mentioned law enforcement, I'll start with you.
Sure. So, you know, collaboration partnership is obviously at the backbone of what we do within law enforcement. We would be the first to say that we don't have all the answers, and so we're relying upon our relationships with both our federal partners and also our private sector partners to inform net defense cybersecurity. And so, you can point to things like the DHS Analytical Exchange, which is a partnership with, CISA DHS, whose main charge is to protect critical infrastructure, where we get together with other partners, sit down, exchange ideas, intelligence, again, to really inform our way forward and in terms of mitigating threats associated with cyberspace. And so I can point to examples like that, other relationships, NCFTA, NCDC, local relationships that the FBI, again, along with our partners, form with folks around the country in every single state that we operate in. We're charged to develop relationships with critical entities to, again, share and exchange the information and intelligence going to be relevant to them to protect and secure the cyberspace.
I think in terms of partnership, that's absolutely critical. I mean, the old adage around critical infrastructure is that 80-something+% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is operated by the private sector, right? So at the end of the day, the private sector and government have to be working together, and if we're going to tackle this problem, and so that means that we need to be engaged. And we're in AT&T, and a lot of my colleague organizations are involved in a lot of the organizations that were mentioned, NCFTA and others, very active processes today to share information about threats and incidents as they go on. I will say in relation to the Russian threat, one of the things that started here in the last year is the new DHS or CISA stood up the new Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, that was launched around August of 2021. Full disclosure, we're one of the founding members of that organization, and so that group was really set up to be a little bit more nimble and exchange threat information in real time about incidents as they go on. I think that's proven to be a pretty effective process so far. Obviously, it's relatively new and still growing and still sorting through some of the issues there. But those are all examples of how industry and government can partner together to deal with the threats, and I think that's going to continue to be the case going forward, whether it's related to IoT or any other type of cyber threat.
I'll add just a little more to that. Well, I think in the U.S. there's very strong collaboration between the public and private sector, and there are other countries that are getting to be more mature in that area. We're still dealing with a political theme globally of having strong nationalistic or protectionistic views of not just the world, but of IT in particular. And so if each country is doing their own public-private collaboration, we're still dealing with a fractured environment, and just putting that out there is one of the issues that we have to think about.
Now, in the context of your collaboration, one of the things that you collaborate around is the development of best practices and eventually standards. Now, we have the benefit here of having a very noted standards leader in IoT. We also have, of course, AT&T has been in its own capacity and also part of partnerships like CSDE, been doing a lot of work around IoT. And I know that the FBI has also been a vital partner in this effort. So I would just like each of you to just talk to us about how the technological aspects of this are critical to your work and to the collaboration that you just discussed. And ultimately, how vital is it that these best practices get standardized? Whoever wants to jump in.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Obviously, I'm going to say it's important to get standardized because I make my bread with standards. But the reason why it's important to companies like Oracle is we are, for two reasons. It creates a more secure network set of products out there. It raises the bar for everyone. It also helps us go to market globally. So the more harmonization there is between the requirements, particularly for cybersecurity, the easier it is, the less costly, the less time to market we can get our goods and services out there. As far as standards go, in the view of the baseline standard that I'm working on in ISO and IEC is to try to just give a baseline of the risks that could essentially recreate the Mirai attack, where you have zombie devices. But there's every expectation that there should be more standards applied to that based on whatever application the device is created for.
Yeah, just ditto to what Elaine said. I think it's critical that these devices at least have a baseline of security built in, and that's really what a lot of the standards are going to. But also at the same time that we have a more international standard that everyone can follow. And if you think about it, if you're a device maker, right? AT&T is not a device maker, but most of the device makers I know, don't want to have to make a device and do one uniquely for the United States, or one uniquely for France, or for Germany, or England, or the Asia Pacific region, right? You name it, country. And I think the challenge for them is they have to make different if they have to comply with all sorts of different sets of standards around the world, it makes it much more difficult. And the whole point of standards was to make things scalable and efficient. And so we need to find a way to achieve better security while still maintaining the scaling and efficiency gains that we can see through international standards, and not have a fracturing where every country has their own way of doing things. I don't think at the end of the day, that'll actually lead to insecurity, because people will then figure out ways to take advantage of the fracturing of the device, of the market. So I think driving towards international standards is absolutely critical. I do think that, at least in the U.S., the government has been working in that direction for a while. But there are efforts in there's a unique standard being developed by ETSI in Europe, and there's things happening in Asia. And I think ideally those would be more harmonized and consistent than they are today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, anything that we can do to, harden our defenses, the FBI, law enforcement is going to be supportive of, because we recognize that adversaries are going to pursue the weakest point in any network, right? And so, if you look at the growth of IoT in particular, looking at something like 25 billion devices by 2025. I mean, you think about, again, the broadening of the attack space for adversaries who want to, leverage botnets, compromise networks, and so obviously that makes our jobs even more difficult. So anything that we can do to push out standards that folks can adopt, pay attention to, we're obviously strongly supportive of.
So I actually want to pick up on something that you mentioned, Elaine, and Chris alluded to this too when he was talking about the need to create efficiencies. There seems to be, especially in IoT, a difference between some folks who are striving for what I would describe as the holy grail of an international standard, and others who are more leaning in the direction of mutual recognition, where we still try to make it as similar as possible. Can you explain from your perspective some of the pros and cons of each approach? And is there a difference between the core baseline and some of the verticals in terms of is it really important in the verticals to have an international standard?
So the vertical I'm most familiar with as far as a published standard out there is the ETSI EN 303645, I believe it is. And it's a consumer vertical. It's very similar to the project that we're working on in ISO and IEC. The biggest difference is it doesn't require a risk assessment for an IoT device developer to come up with, to fully look at threats and how to mitigate them with the device development. It also allows, the risk assessment also allows for accounting for devices that can't deal with some of the requirements that are the required features in the document. That's been the rub with the consumer vertical created by ETSI. But I will say that while they don't have a risk assessment required in that particular standard, they have a lot of outs with respect to constrained devices. So it's not defined exactly what a constrained device is, but that's sort of, I think, a similar issue with having risk assessments, because there is a concern that that's going to be abused.
Chris?
I was just going to add that I think having the standards be risk-based is really critical. And I think, and really, depending upon the use of a device, the risk can vary, right? So you could have an IoT device that was designed for a consumer and is being deployed in a consumer-grade network that then somebody picks up and deploys in a critical infrastructure environment, right? And that same device can have different risks depending upon where it's being deployed. And so you really do need a standard that factors in risk. You can have other devices that are just kind of, I don't want to call them dumb devices, but they're basically just like sensors on a network that don't collect information, right? Or maybe they're just doing minor rudimentary tasks, in which case the security risk of those particular devices is significantly different than it is if it's something that's like, supporting a back office system or an operational support system or something along those lines. So risk is actually a key factor in what the requirements ought to be, and I think we really can't lose sight of that. A couple of years ago, we did an INSTAC report, INSTAC's the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council, and in that we wrote a report on IoT security, and that was one of the key findings, was that whatever the security controls are, they have to be commensurate to the risk, and so I think we can't lose sight of that.
So, Chris, since you mentioned NSTAC did a report in 2021 where they actually talk about some of the cross-sector dependencies. They talked about ICT. They also talked about energy and other sectors. And one of the real sticking points that I took away from that report was that IoT devices could almost be viewed as a glue of critical infrastructure, hence the title of this panel. And I just wanted you to elaborate on that point and maybe talk to the extent that you can about some of the cross-sector dependencies that may exist. And then if any of you want to jump in with respect to how a vertical that maybe not necessarily consumer-based, but just like a more cross-vertical baselines which are being worked on, how those might be applicable.
Yeah, so one of the things the INSTAC is working on right now is what's called an IT-OT convergence report. So the concept of IT-OT convergence is that you have traditional OT systems, operational technology systems, which are things like SCADA systems or systems that were largely used for industrial environments. So think of things like operational systems that would support other utilities and other critical infrastructure sectors like water, power, energy, et cetera. And the concept of OT-IT convergence is that now a lot of those systems that were built, in the 80s and 90s that were not really contemplated to be connected to the internet are now suddenly being connected to the internet because it's more efficient for folks to manage those environments remotely through the internet, through different types of access points. And then on top of that, in the electric grid, just as one example, you now are starting to deploy things like smart meters and smart sensors and all these different types of devices. So you have two different scenarios going on. You have all these new sensors that are being deployed, and then you have a lot of the control systems being connected to the internet. And so in that context, how do we secure that environment, which is vastly different than what it was 20-something plus years ago? And a lot of those operational systems really weren't contemplated to have the same levels of security controls as you have in a traditional IT. So I think a lot of what we talk about in that forum is, what are the ways what things should government be doing to, secure that environment, and understanding that we have a different type of deployment going on. And I do think there's a lot of things happening there. A lot of the IoT standards that are being developed would obviously be applicable in that space. But there's a lot of other things that can happen to try to secure that environment. But I do think that is an ongoing concern, that as we move in that direction, how do we build and bake in the security from the get-go so that we're not vulnerable when it comes to the critical infrastructure?
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that point? All right, Chris hit it out of the park. So we got here, someone mentioned JCDC, and I want to broaden that to just information sharing and incident response where industry and government are working together more broadly in the domain of botnets and IoT. Now, I know there's been a lot of planning efforts. For example, the Council to Secure the Digital Economy put out a paper in 2019 that was viewed as influential by CISA. There was the JCDC, of course, is now one of the primary venues where these sorts of conversations are happening. But there's also a technical standards conversation that's happening, for example, at FIRST and other organizations. So in this space of incident response and in terms of just how information sharing and collaboration between the public and the private sectors is important. Could you all kind of just elaborate on your experiences or any insights you may have there?
Yeah, I think I said it earlier in terms of the importance of collaboration and partnership. I look at our relationship with CISA, with Secret Service, other players in the space in terms of from an incident response standpoint. We're now at a point, with pending legislation or legislation that's been passed where folks are going to have to report cyber incidents to CISA. We have said that it doesn't matter where an incident gets reported to, as long as it gets reported. The partnership that exists between the FBI, DHS broadly, and CISA in that space is such that when CISA goes out, you can expect that FBI will be with them, or that the information that is being passed to the FBI is going to be shared with CISA, so on and so forth. We recognize that there are silos in this space, and it's critically important for us to break down those silos and share information broadly, not just within the government, but obviously outside the government as well, to better inform net defense. So, I can't say enough about how important it is, and it's an attitude, a posture that the federal government is leaning into and recognizing how important it is that we partner in this space.
There's obvious benefits with information sharing for not just the government, but the private sector. The other side of the debate is that's coming up a lot in the last year is incident reporting and requirements around that. And I think it's important to think about the cost to companies to be able to regularly be doing the incident reporting, at what stage they're doing it, how much time window they're given to collect certain amount of information, as opposed to dealing with an ongoing attack. It makes it difficult to recommend making those requirements. But it's something worth exploring. We've seen it happen, this discussion occur across many countries, and that's another area for potential harmonization where a standard would be useful.
So I'll offer a couple thoughts. So in terms of partnerships, as mentioned earlier, there's lots of different venues where information sharing and partnerships are being built, whether it's in the U.S. or this is an international audience, but outside the U.S. as well. So within the U.S., there's things like the JCDC that I mentioned, but also the CISB, which is another program in CISA. There's the CISA just through the regular ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. There's a continual engagement with the sectors on information sharing. And I think since the 2015 information sharing, ironically named CISA, the information sharing law that was passed, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, there's been a pretty robust increase in the level of sharing both by the private sector and by government. So I think we're definitely turning in the right direction there. That's an issue that's always going to need more work because it's never perfect, but I do think that progress is being made there. Specific to botnets that Paul mentioned, on botnets, there's been a litany of items written in the U.S. at least in relation to practices to address botnet security. I'll go back. I mentioned NSTAC earlier. We did an NSTAC report in 2017 that addressed a bunch of different recommendations related to improving the security of the internet ecosystem that included botnets as one of the issues. Piggybacking off of that, NTIA, the I'm losing my track of my acronyms here, but the NTIA did a report also on botnets where they did a green paper at the Commerce Department laying out a bunch of recommendations on botnets, and then subsequent to that we've had additional discussions around different aspects of botnets and malware with the current administration. So that issue's been going on for, I can take it back to at least the last 10 years. We've had numerous discussions about how to address botnets and malware and associated threats. It's never going to be perfect, but I think there's a lot of recommendations that have been written and a lot of practices out there that are intended to get at the root of that problem.
All right. So staying on the subject of botnets, one of the things that we've seen in recent years is an evolution of botnets. Now, this is nothing new. They've been evolving for decades, but one of the more troubling aspects that you see is greater survivability, which can make it more difficult to mitigate the consequences. Even, for example, let's say from a law enforcement perspective, and you can check me on this, but I think that even after you get some of the criminal operators behind bars, it can be an increasingly difficult task to actually stop the damage that they've done. So given the, and this is just one of the many ways that botnets are evolving, they're just becoming more distributed, more complicated, they're leveraging AI. Given this increasing complexity, what are some of the things that you believe could be done from the perspectives of your organizations, both to better collaborate to fight against this threat and to hold the bad actors responsible?
I think it's actually doing the very thing that we're doing right here, which is having a discussion, increasing awareness, promulgating standards. The FBI and our partners, we have had some success with mitigating botnets through access to C2 servers or holding the individual who's responsible accountable. But I think what you're referencing is peer-to-peer botnets, which are shared freely and make it more difficult for us to intercept, right? So there's a couple botnets that have popped this year: Fritz Frog, Mosey, all peer-to-peer. One, I think in the instance of Mosey, it had been dormant for about a year, and again, with peer-to-peer, it's very difficult for us to get in front of that. And so in that respect, we push it back on to the end user, of some of these devices, some of the pieces that are connected to networks, and making sure that good cyber hygiene is practiced, that passwords are updated, all the things that we routinely share with private sector, public sector as well, to make sure that everyone's doing their own part to secure the cyberspace just a little bit better.
This is a complicated question because I think you're right about the peer-to-peer side of things. Like I was looking earlier, a couple months ago, at a new proposal in Canada that was calling for network operators to essentially sinkhole or block, C2 sites for botnets. But I think unfortunately the consequence of that will be that they'll just go underground and they'll do more peer-to-peer, and which will make it even more difficult to track the botnets. So we're kind of in a chicken and the egg situation here, where it's really, the more we try to prevent them, the more they go underground, and it becomes even more harder to track what's going on. So basically, a lot of these organizations are criminal organizations, so it's just how do you stay on top of that and stay in front of that game? That's going to be a challenge for a long time. I do think that goes to the latter part of your question, Paul, about raising the stakes for the attackers. I think this is an issue I've harped on for years and years in these policy panels, but at the end of the day, there's only so much we can do on the technical side to stop these things from happening. But a determined attacker who has resources and time, generally speaking, is going to be able to figure out ways to attack different types of infrastructure. I don't want to scare anybody, but that's just the reality. And so if that's the case, then there's got to be, and in a lot of cases, these entities, especially nation-state actors, they don't feel any real gumption to not pursue these types of efforts, right? So at some level, we have to make it more, there has to be more of a consequence that's associated with it. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because that's a really challenging geopolitical question that I know the U.S. government's well aware of this and trying to figure it out, but I think that has to be part of the equation.
All right. Well, just bringing it back to the geopolitics that just came up, I think that as we examine how botnets and IoT security have come up in the context of the crisis in Ukraine, one of the things that we're looking at is how can some of the more, I don't want to use the word basic, but just some of the cyber hygiene questions that have been emphasized for many years, how could just achieving that sort of baseline security help in some of these high stakes scenarios? Because, and I would like to hear from the panel of experts here. I mean, there are some folks who feel that just basic cyber hygiene, while it would not prevent these sorts of attacks, it would actually make it more difficult, not just in of course, the very big problem of cybercrime, but even in some of the more significant situations that we've been talking about. So I would like to just putting those thoughts out there, get a reaction from the panel, just talk about your cyber, how important is cyber hygiene, and what is your organization's perspective on the next steps? This should be like mom and apple pie.
It's difficult. I mean, from an Oracle perspective, we are not selling to individual consumers, nor we're really aiming at enterprise customers. So a lot of it's built in, and not surprisingly, most people, surveys have shown that they learn their cyber hygiene practices from their workplaces. So, I mean, potentially enterprise cloud and other types of managed services can sort of teach, build in those kinds of tools to help the general population increase their knowledge of cyber hygiene. But yeah, it's a difficult problem. I've seen PSAs in other countries, like a poster in the subway of a couple other countries, so I find that interesting.
So this cyber hygiene is actually, it's an interesting topic. I would say from a company perspective, it's absolutely critical that you at least have the basics on security, right? And most big companies I've been around, they go way beyond just basic hygiene, right? I mean, they're deploying all sorts of different security tools and are well aware of the challenges there. But I think it's on the consumer side, I've had the opportunity a few years ago. I spent about 10 years on the board of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, which ran the cybersecurity awareness campaign, which used to be called Stop, Think, Connect, and now it's changed. But during that time period, we were trying to get consumers to be more aware of cybersecurity and take basic steps to protect themselves. And I think despite all the different campaigns and things that have been done, I still feel like we struggle as an industry with that problem. And I think it's largely because it's just so complicated, right? Like, people have drawn an analogy and said, oh, well, it's similar to like getting people to wear seatbelts for seatbelt safety, except for if you tell somebody to wear a seatbelt with like, what are they, a click it or ticket type of campaign, right? You have to plug in the seatbelt. That's all you have to do, right? Cybersecurity, we sit there and tell them, well, you got to patch your machine, update all your software, deploy your antivirus. Like, we make it so complicated at the end of the day. And there's been efforts I think Microsoft's done this with Windows, where you can deploy, like, where you can basically reset your machine and go back to previous instances. And I think we've tried to make it simpler, but I still feel like for the average consumer, it's a little overwhelming and still a huge challenge.
Yeah, I guess I'll just go back to a point you made during the last question, in that, cyber incidents are going to happen no matter what you do, no matter what defenses you put out there. So I guess the question is, okay, well, how bad is it when it does happen? And so what steps are you taking to mitigate damage to networks, right? Are you backing up your networks on a routine basis? Are you appropriately segmenting the network? Are you adopting and striving towards zero trust, right? All the things that are going to mitigate sort of a cascading failure when that attack does happen, right? So, I think all is not lost. People are really leaning into the cyber defense atmosphere and really adopting good cyber hygiene, recognizing that nothing's going to be perfect here. But I think if people can just do things at a baseline level to, again, mitigate some of the damage that may happen when these attacks do occur, I think we'll see some significant progress in the space.
All right. At this point, we would like to turn it over to the audience for some questions. We have the benefit of some really top IoT security talent here, so please don't be shy.
Hi, Dan Caprio. Thanks for a great panel. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned at the beginning, Paul, and it's come up, but the issue of standards. And so there's been some reference to ISO, there's been some reference to ETSI, and other standards bodies. I guess what I'm wondering is sort of what's the status, because Chris mentioned the importance of international standards and interoperability, but what's the status of the standards process within ISO, and kind of what's the what's the hang-up? I mean, this seems like motherhood and apple pie, and I mean, particularly with the way the panel's set up and, you know, the glue of critical infrastructure and the vulnerability of connected devices in Ukraine. And there's been a lot of attention paid to, I mean, particularly transatlantic cooperation on issues around Ukraine. Export controls come to mind. Why aren't, I mean, I guess the question is, you know, where do we stand with ISO, and why can't we get our act together between the U.S. and Europe to get on the same page?
Elaine, you want to take that one?
I have some bad news, I guess, on that front. When it comes to standard strategy, the U.S. and has been, the government has been very adamant about the importance of private sector, multi-stakeholder processes and consensus-based processes to come up with technical standards. There was a European standard strategy released on Groundhog Day this year, and they're taking a very deliberate position to create European standards. And they have mentioned China most of the time when they're talking about who they're trying to drive out, but they'll also sometimes mention U.S. companies. So we're dealing with different government policies at different levels, different agencies, and it definitely affects cybersecurity and other technical standards. As for ISO, you know, it's notoriously slow. We have an unfortunate hang-up right now, but it's, in reality, I think it's only taken 4 years if we wrap up this year. That sounds like a very long time, but if you look at how long it took for like the U.S. bill in the House, I think it was, or Senate, it was Warner, and I'm forgetting the Colorado, Gardner, thank you. That also took probably close to 4 years to pass, and a standard can be updated more easily than a law. And it has the benefit of being international. There was another aspect to your question that I'm forgetting.
So the other aspect, or sort of the harder part of the question is, you know, we've seen so much collaboration, I mean, around Ukraine. And it seems like there's so much that we could do, I mean, in terms of protecting critical infrastructure, I mean, particularly in cooperating with the Europeans, that if we could promote this, the ISO standard, that would really help to sort of solve a big part of the problem. And I'm just wondering, like, why that's not happening.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, NIST is very much involved in the standards process under ISO and IEC. There's less government involvement from others. I will say there's one nice development where Singapore, which has been using the ETSI-EN for IoT, they've come into the ISO IEC committee, the same one where the baseline is being developed, to create a framework for labeling instead of doing it in just a European or just a Singapore or regional standards body. But I think in general, standards are very difficult for government policy type policymakers to get into. It's not the most exciting and fast-paced moving activity. So, I mean, in general, you don't see that many people from government directly involved in the standards. And it is an area where people who do standards for a living could try to help improve that. But I don't know what would get more government people involved.
So I'll offer a comment on the standards issue. This, and then taking it broader than just the IoT topic of the panel today, but standards kind of writ large. We just wrote a letter from the INSTAC back in May that we sent to the White House on how to deal with, or how to improve standards participation. And one of the key recommendations we had in there was that there needs to be some sort of strategic alliance going on between the U.S. and its allies. I am concerned that standards is becoming fodder for the current geopolitical tensions between the U.S., Europe, and China. And what we're starting to see is that each one of them are kind of falling back into their own quarters. So in Europe, we've started to see ETSI, which is an organization that a lot of U.S. companies participate in, including my own, because we operate in Europe, quite frankly. And so we try to drive, one of the ways we try to achieve harmonization is by having representation in ETSI from U.S. companies. And then if you look at ATIS, which is the U.S. Corollary to ETSI, they have a lot of European operators that are part of ATIS. So that's one way you drive harmonization. But we're starting to see, like in the European standard strategy, where they're calling for really diminishing the vote of non-European entities inside ETSI. So you would see where, like the ETSI board would all be European headquartered businesses. And so you're getting to a place where that has the risk, I think, of creating a fracturing between the different regions of the world where you have different entities kind of driving their own standard strategy. And I think that could be highly problematic, and especially when we consider the concerns that that both Europe and North America have in relation to China. So there is a need, I think, to have all of these countries kind of working together, at least the allied countries working together in terms of standard strategy, and that's one of the things that we talked about in the NSTAC report, amongst so many other items. But I think that's a key issue.
Got a question over there?
Yes. Hi, I'm Rick Land, CEO of Iggy Ventures, and we advise and invest in technology startups. And so following up on Dan's question about standards, for example, a company that I'm involved with, Security Matters, developed a technology that basically is barcodes at the submolecular level that works in gases, liquids, and solids. So you could scan a motherboard and you could tell from the resin where it came from all the way through the computer chips, just by scanning and using blockchain in the back end. I mean, it'd be an incredible standard to have because it could really help eliminate counterfeiting, even counterfeit money, if you think about it, because we could do the ink or the paper. But you're talking about standards, and Oracle, AT&T, large companies can travel the world on these standards. You have a small company based out of Israel that has developed an amazing technology, but getting into that standards process is too expensive. It's prohibitive. And so you can lose some amazing technology solutions because there aren't resources for small business. They're doing R&D, right? They've developed, again, a scanner that can scan, iPhone and tell you what's counterfeit inside it. But yet, how do you get something like that into the forefront of a Oracle, AT&T, the FBI, Department of Defense, or any other standard organization if you just don't have the resources to get there? And so you may have some great technologies that are dying on the vine.
Chris, you want to start with that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We actually did talk about that issue specifically in the NSTAC report that we wrote, because we were briefed by about 20 some odd standards experts, and one of the things we heard over and over, especially in the telecom space, there's a lot of smaller. Right now, there's a huge issue around gradually moving networks towards being software defined and using things like Open RAN and those types of technologies. But a lot of the companies that are on the forefront of that are smaller entities that, quite frankly, can't afford to send people to standards meetings around the world. So we wrote some recommendations there, and specifically around, the people who bring the best technology generally have the most sway in a standards body, right? So the U.S. needs to invest in R&D, and there's lots of different things that they can do to do R&D, whether it's grants, tax credits, et cetera. And then we also talked about, we talked about the same thing in relation to standards participation. So are there incentives that U.S. government can help provide to smaller entities, whether that's literally things like, through RFPs, actually providing direct funding support, whether it's grant programs, whether it's, again, tax credits and other things to help facilitate more people to go to these standards meetings, including from smaller players. So that's another item is in there. The other issue is quite frankly making the U.S. a more appetizing location to do standards meetings. A lot of the standards meetings are held outside the U.S. because, to be quite frank about it, we have pretty restrictive temporary visa policies where we can't host standards meetings here because we can't grant visas to a lot of the participants from outside the United States. And so what we end up seeing is a lot of the standards meetings are being held in Europe and Asia and South America and other places, but not here, which actually drives up the cost for the smaller entities to participate in the meetings because they now have to travel. And nowadays with COVID and everything else, that's compounded that problem. So the NSTAC report lays out a lot of those different types of issues. We're hoping that the White House will try to take some of those on. We're also having some separate conversations on Capitol Hill about the same issues. So I think there's definitely big time interest on the Hill in standards right now on what to do about it. So for folks that are interested in that, I think there's an opportunity here to try to frame some solutions to those problems.
And let us know how I can help on the Hill and a little background there. So.
I'll add a little bit to that. The one good thing, there's more than one good thing, I should say, about the European strategy, but that is one area that they recognize as lacking. And while I haven't been thinking so much about the small and medium enterprise problem, I have been thinking about the government problem. I don't have any great solutions to talk about. But if there are ways where the big companies who are in this space or the standards bodies themselves could do more to share information in a public way without having people join, just so people get an understanding of what does it mean to participate, what projects are going on. Those are things that I think are doable. I think it's a question of who do we reach out to, how do we get people to do it so it's worth the time.
Do we have any other questions?
I'd like to share a question from one of our remote participants. Mark Carvel asks, is there a need for regulation or co-regulation to push adoption of security standards in the decision stage of IoT devices and networks?
Anyone want to take that?
I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation here. No, so what I'm just going to say is, like, there may be, right? I'm not certain on that. I think the bottom line is that we need to have a baseline of security in most devices that's linked back to the risk of the device. Now, there's different ways you can get to that place, right? Whether it's regulatory, whether it's incentives-based, whether it's creating things like safe harbors, et cetera. So I'm not going to opine on what the right answer to that question is in terms of how to get those adopted, because I feel like depending upon, I mean, this is an international panel, so depending upon the country that you're in, there's different mechanisms that they might use. In some places, they might be mandatory, quite frankly. In other places, they might use more of an incentive-based approach. I think the bottom line from a network operator's perspective is we want to see better security in the devices. However we get there, that's you know, I think there's different ways to get to that point. But I feel like we do need to have a baseline of security in the devices.
I agree with that. I mean, I think being able to agree on the technical requirements is maybe the most valuable thing. And like Chris was saying, every government's going to make regulatory decisions in the way that their country, their culture is used to. So even though something might be voluntary in the US, it can be required in Europe, but the requirements are the same.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? All right, seeing none, I just want to really thank the panelists for coming here and making this another successful panel at IGF-USA 2022. I hope everybody here enjoyed this as much as I did, and it's great to be here in person this year. Thanks, everyone.